Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm super excited for today's video because we are going to be doing my monthly palette ranking, but we're going to be ranking my palettes based on use for the month. So last year I used to rank every single palette that I used in a month based on like how I was feeling about the palette, but I feel like I struggled every single month because I feel like some of my favorite palettes were ranking like lower just because I was feeling more like colorful on the day that I did my ranking video. So I thought it would be fun this year to do monthly palette rankings so you guys can still see every single palette that I used within the past month. Maybe encourage you to reach for something older in your collection because you see it and it sparks your memory that you own that palette too. But I thought it would be fun to just kind of share the amount of times that I used each palette and kind of track that way. Every single year since 2020, I do a quarterly palette usage update, but now we're just going to be sharing every single month what my palette usage, and I'm really excited about it. Plus, I feel like I have my notebook open in front of me. I feel like it just makes it a little less stressful for me when I film these videos because I don't have to like actually rank based on how I feel about the palette. I'm just sharing use. I had a couple of you guys ask how I track like my no pan left behinds, and I'll just share with you how I track my palette usage as well. So I have this bullet journal, and on one side I have like my palettes kind of like graphed out. I don't know if it's focusing or if you can see. Okay, so on this side I have my palettes graphed out. I have a couple graphed out over here too, a couple additional. And then I literally just list my palettes out and I just like tally every single day that I use the palette. If I use a palette that I haven't yet used that month, I write it down, add a tally. As simple as that. So I did end up actually using a total of 33 eyeshadow palettes throughout the month of January, which I'm really excited about. I'm excited to kick the year off with a bang, get use out of a bunch of palettes in my collection. I feel like I brought in quite a few palettes in the last 6 weeks or so, so I do have still what feels like a very full drawer behind me of new palettes I haven't even started to test or try. But if you're interested in seeing which palettes I used in January as well as how many times I reached for each of the palettes that I did use, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project panning content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. All right, you guys, we are going to start with my one uses and work our way up to my most used palette from the month of January. I would love to know if you have any guesses on what you think my most used palette is. It's a bit of a wild card. It is a bit of a wild card, but I'm happy to see it getting use. But let's start with the 16 palettes that I used one time. And we can start with one thing that is currently on my eyes today. It is the Bella Beauté Bar Angles of Illumination. It's so funny. I thought that it was angels, and then I heard someone else talking about this and they said angle, and I was like, are they reading it wrong? And now I'm looking at it and I'm like, nope, I'm reading it wrong. So this is an all shimmer palette, and I picked this up on launch day. I just had to have this, but I haven't gotten around to trying it, and I feel like it's going to take me forever to try this palette because when I use a palette and test a palette, I want to use every single shade at least one time, and I just feel like it's gonna take me a little bit to get through this eyeshadow palette. I just have the shade Moonlight on my eyelids today, as well as a couple other things layered on top. But I am very excited about this palette. I've been a huge fan of everything that I've tried from Bella Beauté Bar. I did purchase this with my own money, but I do have a code with them, which is itsjustSteph if you're ever ordering anything off the site. I know a couple of you have already used my code, and I thank you guys so much because it's like exciting when I wake up to a little email that says one of you purchased something. So I would love to know if you've tried anything from Bella Beauté Bar, what your favorite palette is. I just ordered the Dead Roses palette that they launched for Valentine's Day. But anyway, today was my first day using that palette. I also reached for ColourPop Limoncello one time. I am currently working on, I'm starting a new series on my channel. It's going to be an eyeshadow color series. Blue is going to be the first installment that I do, so I've been working my way through the blues in my collection, and I wanted to reach for this shade La Festa because I haven't reached for this much, and I kind of wanted to see how it performed before I end up filming that video, but I only reached for ColourPop Limoncello one. I also have Natasha Denona Mini Love. I just reached into this, I'm sure, for this shade right here, which is one of my favorite inner corner highlights, but this is a palette that I've set aside to focus on throughout the month of February as a February palette inspo. If you missed that video, I will link it for you in case you're interested in checking that out. I also reached into NARS Suede one time. I reached into this just because I was doing like a quick, simple, I wanted one matte shade in the crease and then I wanted to put ColourPop Ritz all over the eyes. So I just reached into this shade right here. But this is just a really handy dandy, very useful little 6-pan. Reached for that once. I also reached for my Aether Beauty Rose Quartz Quad once, and this is another palette that I plan to pull out for the month of February. I feel like this is like the perfect little quad to get use out of this time of year, so this one will be coming along for the ride. A new palette to me is the NARS Afterglow Irresistible. I've reached for this once and I did get use out of quite a few shades the one time that I did reach into this palette. Loved the look that I created. I loved the NARS formula, and this palette definitely did not disappoint. These shades on these outer 3 shades are going to be my absolute favorite. They're that really metallic lid toppery sort of shade that NARS does so well, and I'm really excited to continue to play around with this palette. We all know how much I love checkered things, although I will say it does kind of annoy me that the checkers aren't just like a normal checkered print. Like, they're kind of like mismatched and uneven. Kind of drives me crazy. Okay, I also reached for ColourPop on Cloud 9 one time. I was using this towards the end of 2023 and I wanted to finish testing this out, so I had like 2 more shades I needed to get use out of. This is definitely not a favorite palette of mine. It's pretty lackluster and I just don't really love it. So there's that, but I did reach for this one additional time to complete my testing process with this palette. I also reached for Menagerie Pastel Pup once, and I reached into the shade Aquatic, this really beautiful pastel blue. I've been loving blues. Again, I have that blue color series coming, and I wanted to get use out of this, and I will say this performed like better than I remember. I was like, okay, maybe in my head I've been giving this palette a hard time because I feel like these shades do hard pan quite easily, but I was really impressed with that shade when I used it, so makes me want to keep reaching for that. I also reached for NARS Climax one time. I honestly can't even remember what shade I reached into this palette for, but I did reach for it once. This is a palette that doesn't get enough love out of me, especially the beautiful, really metallic, kind of like chunky shimmers in this palette they're gorgeous. They definitely don't get enough love for me. I was also trying to like go through some of my like mini palettes and no pan left behind a few things just as like bonus no pan left behind, so that I can try and get ahead of no pan left behinding as many palettes as possible this year. So one of the palettes that I reached for was the Natasha Denona Mini Biba, and oh no, one of my shades just fell out, the cream to powder. I wish some of my shades would fall out of some of my other Natasha Denona minis, because I feel like there's like a lot of my minis, I'm like, oh, I just want like 1 or 2 shades out of my minis. I wish that they popped out like they do the rest of the Natasha Denona palettes, but I reached for this once. This is definitely not a favorite. I definitely prefer the Natasha Denona Mini Nude. I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to keep this one around through the rest of this year. We'll see. I did also reach for my Denona Lightwork Volume 5 one time. I don't remember what shade I reached for from this palette either. Which one was it? I feel like I might have reached for the shade Protected up here, but I can't exactly remember. You guys know how much I love this palette though. I anticipate you'll likely see this the majority of months, getting at least a use, if not multiple uses throughout the year. I also reached into Bronze Seduction one time from Pat McGrath. I believe I reached into this palette for the green. If I'm not mistaken, it may have been this shade right here. I'm not always gonna remember what I reached into. And by the way, a palette use for me just means I reached into the palette for at least 1 shade. That equates to a use. I have my Lethal Cosmetics Wildflower palette. Now this is something going in my No Pan Left Behind series, so shame on me, I've only reached for this one time. Obviously this is going to roll over into the month of February, and I'm going to keep working on this, trying to No Pan Left Behind this. I do think this is a really beautiful palette, and when I purchased this last year and was creating looks with this palette to test it out, I really love the looks that I created. So I'm excited to continue to play with this, but I did only end up reaching for it once in the month of January. And then the final 3 palettes I only reached for one time. I have the, not this one, where is it? Okay, I have the Pat McGrath, I believe this is the Subliminal palette. I actually do have this on my eyes today as well. I used these 2 matte shades as well as a bit of these 2 shades right here, again mixed with some other things. I really love the way that this eye look turned out, and I will say I do really love this palette from Pat McGrath. I think it looks so boring, but I always love the way that my look turns out, and I feel like maybe it's because this is more of like an approachable blue palette. Like it's not an entirely blue palette, and it's mostly just like cool toned like browns and grays with like a pop of like, but the pops of blue just do this palette so much justice. I love it so much. So I have those 2. I also reached into Pat McGrath's Voyeuristic Vixen Quad one time, and I do plan to focus on this in February as well. So I plan to No Pan Left Behind this in February, which I'm excited for because this palette was definitely and has definitely been neglected in its lifetime with me, so that needs to get some more use. And then the final palette that got 1 use, so I have been creating a custom Natasha Denona midi palette. This was my custom palette in the month of January. I reached into my custom palette a total of 6 times, but I also have like the shade names and which palette each of the shade comes from written down. And so I've tallied like 1 use for each shade that comes from like that specific palette. I don't know if that makes any sense, but for Natasha Denona Sunrise, and maybe I can show you guys. Okay, yeah. So this shade right here is from the Sunrise palette. This is the shade Awakening. Reached for this once, so I counted that as 1 use in the Sunrise palette. So my Sunrise palette right now actually is my current February custom palette. I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to spoil it. If you want to see what's in this palette, go watch my February palette inspo video, but also this wouldn't look like the Sunrise palette at all. I will say doing a custom palette, I feel like is really, and has already proven that it's really going to help me get more use out of like all of my Natasha midi palettes. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but 1 use on that. Okay. Moving into 2 uses, I have 6 palettes that I reached for 2 times. 2 of them being Natasha Denona mini palettes. Both of these were going in a project for me to No Pan Left Behind. So up first we have my Natasha Denona mini nude, and if this spoils the project that these are a part of, I do apologize, but I did reach for this 2 total times. Freaking love the way that my looks turn out when I use this palette. It's one of my favorite Natasha palettes in general, but definitely my favorite mini palette. Even though this has been officially completed as a No Pan Left Behind palette, we know I'm going to continue to reach for that throughout the year. And then my Natasha Denona Mini Pastel I reached for twice in order to No Pan Left Behind. This is just a fun little 5-pan palette. One of my more favorite ones, even though it's not like the most cohesive color story. I feel like it's a really fun companion palette to have. I also really love this green gold sort of shade, and I think the shades are fun and pretty. So I reached for that twice. I also reached for the Aether Beauty Amartine Quad 2 times. I love a dusty mauve purple, and I feel like this is a very neutral, everyday wearable look. Very easy for me to create a look to wear to work. I pretty much do the same look every single time, but I reached for this twice in January. Plus, those are just tones I typically reach for more frequently in the colder months. I also reached for my NARS Rising Star palette twice. This is something I did pull out to focus on in January, and I'm really happy that I was able to create a couple of looks with this. I created a look where I used this really beautiful satin lavender all over the lid, and I absolutely love the way that that look turned out, and I had fun reaching for this. The metallics in this are kind of like that chunky texture similar to the NARS Climax, and that it's a little bit stickier but so metallic on the eyes and so beautiful. So I'm really glad that I pulled this out because I was feeling like this was a little bit neglected last year, so glad that right away in 2024 we could get a couple uses on it. I also reached for my LH Cosmetics Shimmer Saga Quad twice. I feel like I reached for this more than twice. I really like this when I am trying to just like spruce up a look that's feeling a little bit dull. And then this also serves as a really good inner corner highlighting palette or little mini quad as well. So I anticipate this will get a ton more use for me this year, especially because my daughter destroyed my KVD, my Kat Von D Alchemist, like my favorite inner corner highlighting little palette of all time, is no longer with us. So this is going to have to serve a purpose. And then 2 times I reached for the Natasha Denona Zendo palette, and which one, and I'll show you out of my custom palette. The shade out of the Zendo palette I reached for twice is this shade right here, and that is called Mindful. It is a cream to powder, kind of deeper brown sort of shade, and I really enjoyed using that. So that came out of the Natasha Zendo palette, and I used it twice. All right, that means we are on to the 3-use palettes, and I have 3 palettes that I reached for 3 times. Up first, we have my Rowan 75 Degrees quad. This is something I'm working on in my Rolling Project 10 pan for the year. And I know only reaching for it 3 times in a month, it is not gonna help me like hit pan on these shades. But I'm trying to ease my way into it. I'm not putting pressure on myself. And this is something that I plan to be in that Rolling Project 10 pan all year. I just wanna track my progress, see if I can hopefully have pan in all 4 shades by the end of the year. If not, potentially complete like this shade right here. But this is a warmer toned cream eyeshadow palette, and I anticipate I'll get more use out of this in the summertime. I obviously was reaching for a lot of blues and a lot of cooler tones this month, and I'm not going to pressure myself to reach for something that isn't setting the tone of like what I want the vibe for my makeup to be. So I also reached into the Natasha Denona Retro Glam palette 3 times. Again, the shade coming out of my Natasha Denona custom palette. And for Retro Glam, got it, I reached for this shade up here 3 times. So the 3 uses out of the Retro Glam were all the same shade, and the shade name is Flutter, and it's this really beautiful kind of sparkly champagne sort of shade. Really, really beautiful. Love it as an inner corner highlight. That's how I got use out of it. So 3 uses, Retro Glam. And then this actually does look like the actual palette it is. It is my Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. I haven't taken any of the shades out of this palette. So this is how it looks if you were to buy it. And I reached into this 3 total times. I'm actually surprised I didn't reach into this more than 3 times. I did a pan that palette last year for the ABH Sultry palette, and this is kind of like giving me the sultry vibes now, being a little bit more neutral and not quite so cool toned. So the first few days of the year I was reaching into this palette quite a bit, and then I started to like go ham on all of my different palettes, different projects, etc. But I have a feeling this will get a ton of use out of me this year, if not for anything other than even like the neutral mattes in this palette. I feel like just serve a purpose in my collection. So 3 uses on that. Moving on to the 4-use palettes, I also have 3 4-use palettes. Up first, I have the Odin's Eye Norns palette, which I'm working on in my No Pan Left Behind. I've created some really fun looks with this, and I was thinking initially maybe I would end up decluttering this palette later this year, but I did want a No Pan Left Behind it so I could make a final decision, and through that I've decided that I really do enjoy some of the shades in this palette, and I likely will end up keeping this palette. Not every shade, but I really do love this bottom row. I also love Amber Place Pink Chameleon and some of the other shades sprinkled throughout here. So I'm really glad that I was able to pull this palette out, get 4 uses on it. I anticipate I'll have a couple extra uses in February. I do want to reach into Passion and do like a red liner. So you'll probably see this palette again when we do our February wrap up. The Cosmic Brushes Muse palette, I am so impressed with. It only took me 4 uses of this palette to use every single shade at least one time. I actually feel extremely creatively inspired when reaching into this, and I feel like normally a palette with 20 shades would overwhelm me, but these shadows are so easy to work with. I get the hype around Cosmic Brushes. After using this palette, it made me want to go onto the website and purchase every other palette. I'm gonna wait, but I anticipate in the future I will purchase as many Cosmic Beauty palettes as possible. Their mattes are so incredibly easy to work with. Their duochromes are so freaking beautiful, so smooth, so good. Their metallics are super intense, and I am just so utterly impressed with their formula. I put this palette aside for a little bit so I could use other things because I was so excited to use this. I used this like 4 days in a row, and I really want to get back to this palette. Sometimes it's so hard because you have like such a big palette collection, and then like you want to like use this every single day, and it's like, but I got to use my other things. So maybe I should just really purchase this eyeshadows, but that's impossible. I don't know if I said there were 4 in the 4 use category, but there's only 3. And then the third palette that I reached for 4 times is the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. I love this palette so much. It's so beautiful. These 4 shades right here, even this shade right here, I just think are absolutely stunning. This is a really good like bronzy gold as well. And then I do really like the shade right here for an inner corner highlight. For like a work appropriate look, it ended up being a little bit smokier and a little darker than I wanted. I stuck to this quad one day, but this shade right here is such a flaky, sparkly, just delicious blue brown, but in the sparkliest way shade. I love it so much. I like want to reach for this palette every day too, specifically like just for that shade. Can't do that stuff. We gotta step outside the comfort zone. All right, next up we have the palettes that I reached for 5 total times, and I have 3 palettes in this category as well. Up first, I have my Rowan Mood Forever quad, and I had so much fun with this one. I like this one because we have like warms as well as like this cool tone shade right here. I also sometimes will lay down this cream, like satin cream shade as like a lid, like a base almost. This I will say is not my favorite shade ever. I just feel like this one's pretty lackluster, but these 3 shades I love so much so that even though I've already reached for this 5 times, this is still a February palette inspo palette because I just think it's going to be beautiful with all of the red and pink themed looks that I have planned. So this one you'll be seeing again. And then the Natasha Denona Retro palette, I reached for 5 total times. A lot of the shades in this palette come from the Retro palette. It's also in the Retro palette, but the shades I can specifically point out that I reached for. So we have Nude Mauve right here, which came out of the Retro palette, and I reached for that a total of 4 times. We also have the shade, I believe, Patty, if I'm reading my writing correctly, which is this shade right here. I reached for that one once. Then the shade Andy, which is this cream to matte, really beautiful, like purpley mauve sort of shade, I reached for 2 times. This shade up here is the shade Psych out of the Retro palette, and I reached for that 4 total times. Obviously some of these, like I was reaching for these shades together. And then I also have this shade right here, which is a cream to matte deep brown shade in the shade, I believe it's called Apart. Reached for that once. And the shade right here is Helio, also from the Retro palette. I also reached for that 1 total time. I had so much fun creating looks with this palette. I think I have a couple of, at least 1 picture that I took with a look that I created using mostly shades out of the Retro palette. I'll post that right here so that you guys can see. I haven't quite decided how I want to, like, I've been taking obviously pictures of looks that I've been creating. I don't think I'm going to include them in this video. Some I'll include in my No Pan Left Behind, and then I obviously will do like hopefully 100 looks with 100 different palettes midway through the year, and then at the end of the year, but at least 50 midway through the year. And I'll share a lot of the looks that I've created there. And then the other palette that I've reached for 5 times is the Ensley Rain Cold Moon palette. I did actually do a video where I did 3 looks 1 palette, my first time ever filming a 3 looks 1 palette video. That is up on my channel in case you're interested in seeing a few of the looks that I created with this palette. What I love about this palette is it is so incredibly quick to create looks. I can just do 1 matte and 1 like special sparkly metallic shade on the lid, holographic shade, and because these shades are so special, they just really bring something to the eyes that make it look like you really put a lot of effort into your makeup, but it took you 5 minutes to do your eyeshadow. Love that about this palette. I've gotten so many compliments with the videos that I've filmed wearing this eyeshadow palette, so thank you guys so much for all of your kind words. I really have been enjoying this, and I'm so excited to continue to try more things from Ensley Rain because I'm so impressed with that. Okay, we're to my top 2 most used eyeshadow palettes of the month. They're not super exciting, they're not, but coming in at number 2, I reached for this palette 11 total times. and it is my Dose of Colors Baked Brown palette. I included this in a video that I called These Products Will Self-Destruct, and I gave myself specific goals on really old products in my collection, and I have to reach those goals or I have to declutter the products at the end of the year. So this is one of those products, and I said I need to use up this cream shade, or I need to have a pan in every single shade within this palette. So clearly I want to keep this palette in my collection because I got right to work on using this lid setting shade. I've been using this to set my lids, and you know, we're gonna end up finishing this pan. You will continue to see this palette, I'm sure, as one of my most used palettes until we clear that pan out. And then my most used, most reached for palette in the month of January was the Persona Identity 1 palette, and I'm so happy because I talk about this palette all the time as a favorite on my channel, but this has been a very neglected palette for a couple of years. So I'm so glad that it's finally getting the love it deserves. You'll notice down here it looks a little different, and I actually popped this shade out, which it was glued in. It's not magnetic. But this I have been using as an eyebrow powder, which is how I've gotten quite a bit of use out of this palette. But I also No Pan Left Behind in this palette, and I just, I love this palette so much. I think it is so beautiful. It's so easy to work with. My palette is old, and I have seen no changes in the quality of this palette. I love the metallics in here because they're so smooth on the eyelids. And they're like intense without being this super like flashy metallic, but they're still intense and just still look like you put forth so much effort to create a look that really is so simple to create. So I ended up reaching for this palette a total of 13 times. And this is another one I think you will still continue to see in these monthly palette rankings in the top, because I continue to use, I'm like loving using brow powder in the brows again, and this is like the perfect shade for me. So most used palette of the month of January was the Persona Identity 1 palette. And that is gonna wrap it up for this palette ranking by use. I would love to know if you have been tracking your palette usage and maybe what your least used but still used palette from January was, and your most used. Let a girl know in the comments below. Other than that, thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.